Morning. Welcome to worship this morning. My name is Adam Hildebrandt, and I get to be one of the pastors here at LVfirst. It is such a joy and a privilege to have all of you join us in worship today. We're talking about certain stories. We're picking up different stories in the Gospel of Luke that really, I think, point to what Luke was trying to say to all of us. What Luke was writing this letter that is the Gospel to this person named Theophilus. Theophilus, which we learned in the first week, literally means friend of God. And so this letter is really a letter to all of us, inviting us to see Jesus through a certain lens, inviting us to see the stories and the teachings of Jesus as invitations to hear good news, to experience forgiveness, to see something more in the world, or to have some sense of insight into the world around us, to experience freedom, and to know of God's goodness each and every day in our lives. And so those are the frames that we're trying to read the Gospel of Luke through. And as we talk about the different stories that we encounter throughout the Gospel of Luke, those are the things that we're looking for, and those are the things that we're thinking about. And today, I want to have a conversation with us about fear. I want to talk about fear, which is, everybody's like, ooh, that sounds exciting. Great conversation for Valentine's Day weekend. Really excited to talk about fear on a holiday weekend. But some of you, even in terms of Valentine's Day weekend, you experienced a little bit of fear as you drove home from work on Friday and realized it was Valentine's Day and you hadn't gotten your significant other something. And so that sense of fear and dread kind of rose in you as you thought, where can I go to get some flowers? Where can I go to get a card? Where can I go to get something to give to my spouse? You experience fear. We experience fear in lots of different ways, in lots of different places. And so I want to just start with this question. What are you afraid of? And all of us would fill in that blank in lots of different ways. All of us would talk about what we're afraid of in lots of different ways. We could acknowledge some of those fears that we have, but there are fears that we don't often talk about. There are fears that we have that are rooted deep inside of us that we might not even realize or claim. And some of those fears are affecting the way that we live in the world around us. Honestly, if I'm to believe my news feed on my phone, I should actually be afraid of everything, right? Literally everything. Everything in the world right now, it feels like, is something that I should be afraid of, that I should have fear about. I should have fear about everything that's taking place. And the way that the news tends to cast everything that they report invites us to fear even more and more and more, because it keeps us coming back for more. There's something about our brain that wants more information on that. And one of the things that is the scariest, one of the things that I respond to with the greatest fear response is something that I even care the most about. It's my kids, right? Because I don't know if you've ever had this experience where one of your kids wakes up in the night, has a bad dream, that's something that they're scared of, they have some sense of fear, they very quietly somehow walk into your room without you noticing, and then they get as close as they possibly can to your face and say, Dad, in like the scariest voice possible, right? You wake up to a person this far from your face with crazy bed hair, and you're like, the devil has come to get me. I had a bad dream. Congratulations, you now are my bad dream. Good job. Fear is a natural response that all of us have at different points and different stimulus in our life. Different things take place. Fear is just something that we all deal with. I have some fears. I am irrationally afraid of volcanoes and earthquakes. Like I know that sounds, you're like, yeah, I mean, volcanoes are not good, but like the whole time that we were in Yellowstone, one of my kids told me that it's basically just one big volcano waiting to erupt, and I was uncomfortable the whole time. Like, I was just unhappy. Like, I don't like the idea of the ground being molten, and I don't like the idea of the ground moving. Like, terra firma means firm, not moving. So I don't like volcanoes, I don't like earthquakes. I'm really afraid of spiders. My kids love that about me. They love to make fun of me when I squeal and run. I think it's hilarious. We've all got things that we're afraid of. And oftentimes we can't explain exactly why it is that we're afraid of those things. And when we get into situations or times in our lives that elicit fear, we don't have a tendency to show our best in the world. We tend to respond in ways that aren't necessarily our best. Like I said, if I see a spider, I'm going to squeal and run. Maybe not the response that we need in the moment, but that's where I'm going. But there are much deeper fears, much things that we deal with that we wouldn't identify, and they cause us to behave in lots of irrational ways, lots of ways that we wouldn't normally behave if we weren't having a fear response. I like the way psychologist Carl Albrecht conceives of his understanding of fear. He puts it on a hierarchy of fears. He calls it the feararchy. It's a really creative name. I like that. So he says that there are 5 basic categories of fear, and they kind of move up. The base level is the most common. All of us have those. All of us probably have multiple versions of those, and it moves up to these more complex fears that we wouldn't necessarily identify as quickly as some of those base level fears, but they're deeply entrenched in all of us. So the first, the base of this feararchy is extinction, right? This is the fear of annihilation or ceasing to exist. This is kind of that fear of death or existential dread, as Dr. Albrecht calls it, this existential dread of the world around us. It's the panicky feeling we get when we look off the edge of a tall building, that sense that we might cease to exist. Some of the triggers in this could be the dark. We just don't feel like there's anything else. Everything has ceased to exist. Flying, heights, or some fatal disease. The second one, the next layer up, he describes as mutilation, which is one of those words you didn't expect to hear at church this morning. And this is the fear of losing a body part or losing a natural function. This is anytime we feel physically unsafe or under attack. Some triggers in this might include creepy crawlies like spiders and snakes and things like that, animals like dogs or sharks, and any animal that you believe to be harmful. Also some anxieties around crowds or needles or germs or surgical procedures or even making a trip to the dentist. The third level he calls the loss of autonomy. This is the fear of being restricted or confined or trapped, immobilized, paralyzed, restricted, enveloped, overwhelmed, imprisoned, or otherwise controlled by circumstances beyond our control. When it's a physical fear, we often think of it as like claustrophobia. But there are some relational fears involved in this as well. Commitment. If you've ever described someone as having a fear of commitment, this is where that lands on this feararchy. Fear of commitment, fear of poverty, fear of debilitating illness, fear of aging, situations where we feel helpless or powerless, maybe in the workplace or in some other instances. And Albrecht points out that most parents will feel this fear from time to time. Just feeling overwhelmed and trapped and restricted because of the responsibility of their own children. No offense, kids. The fourth is separation, fear of separation or abandonment or rejection. We all have a need to belong. Dr. Albrecht refers to this as a loss of connectedness or becoming a non-person, not wanted, respected, or valued by anyone else. Some triggers might include when a relationship ends, a friendship, divorce, or death of a loved one. Our fears of intimacy or connection come out of this. Extended separations or can often elicit this type of fear. And then that top level That very deepest of things, it's not as common, and we wouldn't identify it as quickly. We wouldn't all say, yeah, I've got that. This is called ego death, or humiliation, or shame, or worthlessness. Because we all want to feel lovable. We all want to feel worthy of love and a sense of value in the world. Examples of this fear might include a fear of failure, or criticism, or bullying, or victimization, or mistakes. Or I don't know if you know this, do you know what the number one fear amongst people is? It's public speaking. People are more afraid to public speak than they are to die, which is a fascinating thing. All sorts of different things are associated with this. You know, that sense of shame, any shame triggers when we get caught in a lie. For some of us who deal with imposter syndrome, it's a fear that we're going to be found out, that we don't know enough, or that we're not enough. These are very real fears that all of us deal with, and they're deep inside, and we wouldn't point to them as much or as readily or as easily as our fear of spiders or molten lava. The scriptures is really, they're really honest about the reality of our struggle with fear. The scriptures talk about fear a lot. One of the most repeated phrases in the scriptures is "do not fear," which is easier said than done. It's a lot easier said than done. Fear is a real thing. We will have fear. We will have difficulties. It won't all be sunshine and rainbows all the time. But what Jesus does is he allows the disciples to be formed in some difficult experiences. To experience the fear, but not to just leave it, that experience of fear. To really unpack what that might mean and how we might deal with the fear that we all have. Because fear is simply a natural response to a real or perceived threat. But more often than not, it pulls our lives into places that we don't want to be. It makes us do things that we wouldn't normally do. Our scripture for today comes from Luke chapter 8, verse 22. Hear this story a little bit. It says this: "One day he got into a boat with his disciples, and he said to them, 'Let us go across to the other side of the lake.'" Let us go across to the other side of the lake. Now, the lake he's talking about is the Sea of Galilee. They call it a lake, sometimes sea. It's about 8 miles across. And just for frame of reference, Lake Lanier is at its widest point 7 miles across. Both lakes have a similar depth. Only one of them is haunted. I'll let you figure out which one. But it's a decent-sized lake. I mean, 8 miles across. You know, if I think about how wide Lake Lanier is at certain places, that's a serious lake to cross. That's a serious lake to go across, especially when you're doing it in a tiny little boat that looks like this. There's not much to keep you protected in that. But that's what boats looked like in Jesus' day. There's not a lot happening there. There's not a lot of safety in that. Jesus says to his disciples, "Hey, let's go across to the other side of the lake." And they're like, "Yeah, no problem." I mean, some of his disciples are fishermen. They spent their whole lives on that lake. They spent their whole lives in boats that looked just like this. They had no problem with this idea of going across the lake. Let's go across to the other side of the lake. So they put out. No problem. Let's go. And while they were sailing, it tells us, Jesus fell asleep. You know, the nice bob of the boat, the waves lapping against the side of the wood boat. You know, Jesus was out. Now, I don't know in that tiny little boat where it was that Jesus went to sleep. I don't know if he's just sleeping right up top there. He's just hanging out, no problem. Maybe he's like my wife when we go on long trips. She sits in that passenger seat and she is out. Jesus falls asleep. All of a sudden, the story says, a windstorm swept down on the lake. In this region, the way that the geography of this area works, the Jordan Rift Valley is to the north of the Sea of Galilee, and oftentimes as pressures changed, winds would push down through the Rift Valley and create huge windstorms on the lake, hurricane-force winds on this otherwise calm lake would create big waves, big worries. And the boat was filling with water, and they were in danger. Right? But don't worry, we've got some fishermen with us. So the boat is there. They're out on the sea. They're with Jesus. Jesus is taking a nap. All of the other disciples are with him. Some of them are fishermen. They're like, hey, we got this. No problem. No worries. As the boat begins to take on water, they're just not too worried. They're like, hey, we've been here before. This is no big deal. But as the boat takes on more and more water, people start getting a little anxious. People start getting a little nervous. They start getting a little bit afraid. This is how our lives look a lot. As the wind comes and the waves come over the top of our boats, all of a sudden they fill more and more, and the fear gets deeper and sinks deeper into that fear. It gets heavier and harder to deal with. It gets harder to maneuver in life. We struggle to focus on anything except for the fear, except for the water that's coming over the top of the boat. And the more we look at the fear, the more it fills up our lives. And all of a sudden, we're in a place that we don't want to be, dealing with things we don't want to deal with. And we try all sorts of things to cope with it. I'm sure the disciples tried all sorts of things to cope with the water coming over the edge of the boat. I'm sure they tried all sorts of things to deal with the water, whether they changed directions, whether they tacked one way or another, whether they grabbed some buckets and said to the other guys in the boat, hey, start bailing. But when the fear is that big, it's like bailing with a teaspoon, right? You're just not getting anywhere. And most of our coping mechanisms, as we feel overcome with fear, as we deal with these fears that are so deep in our lives, look a lot like this. We're just bailing water with a teaspoon. We see the things happening in the world around us and we're afraid, and so we start doom scrolling to try to find out more information on all of the things. But all of the things that we're learning just make us more fearful. We just feel like we're underwater and we're trying to bail with a teaspoon. Or maybe we just avoid it altogether. Like, I just don't want to talk about it. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to have that in my life. Or maybe there's a conversation or a thing that we want to do, but we've been putting off because we're afraid that it might not work out the way that we want it to work out. We're just bailing water with a teaspoon. The fear is weighing us down, and it's taking us down. And we're not sure what to do with all of it. Our coping mechanisms aren't enough to deal with all the water, and we hyperfixate on the fear, and it becomes all that we see. Now, I just want to remind you, throughout this Titanic-esque scene that we've now painted, Jesus is just taking a nap. He doesn't seem concerned at all about this existential threat. He doesn't seem concerned at all about the wind or the waves. He doesn't seem concerned that the boat is filling with water. He's not overly concerned about the circumstances that has everyone else in a panic. All these disciples have tried all these things. At first they're just scared that, we're taking on too much water. This is concerning, and they kind of moved up that feararchy until they were finally able to overcome that fear of ego death. Those braggadocious fishermen who told you that the fish was this big, they had to get over their ego in order to finally think to themselves, hey, we've got Jesus in the boat. Maybe we should wake him up. Maybe he'll have an idea as to what to do. So often we have to come to the end of ourselves before we finally go to the person who can actually make a change, who can actually help us process and think about what's going on around us and see something more than just the wind and the waves. So they yell, Master, Master. They went to him and woke him up. Master, Master, which is ironic because all of them were functioning in this moment as if they could master their fear on their own, as if they could master the situation. Master, Master, we are perishing, or we are lost. So many of us have felt that way. The ship is going down. We're not sure what to do with all of these feelings. We're not sure what to do with all of this fear. We're not sure what to do with all of this anxiety. We're not sure what to do with all of this worry. We just feel like we're sinking more and more, like we are lost. I think it's those disciples act in this moment a lot like we often act. They're so concerned about what is happening. All they're thinking about is the what of the situation. And they forgot about who was with them. Because they're so focused on the what, the wind and the waves, because they're so focused on what's happening around them, because they're so focused on the thing that they're dealing with, the fear that they have, they forget who is in the boat with them. The very Son of God, Master, Master, they say. I think prayer, at its simplest form, is just becoming aware of God's presence in your life. It's just acknowledging that Jesus is on the boat with you. And maybe acknowledging it a little bit earlier before the boat is going down, before our lives are full of fear and we feel like we're lost. Prayer at its simplest form is just becoming aware of God's presence. It's knowing the who in the middle of the what. I love the way Anne Lamott talks about this. She says, one of the simplest and best prayers we can ever pray in our lives is simply this: help. Because we have to work all the way through that hierarchy to get to that place where we move beyond ourselves, where we allow our egos to say, God, help. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do with this bucket full of fear. I don't know what to do because my boat is going down. I'm sinking. I don't know what to do. Help. Help. And Jesus gets up. He woke up, it says, and he rebuked the wind and the raging waves, and they ceased, and there was calm. There was calm. They wake Jesus up. They finally acknowledge his presence. They pray this profound prayer where they just say, hey, Jesus, help. And he rebukes the wind and the waves. Jesus deals with the cause and the effect of what's happening around them. The wind caused the waves, and Jesus isn't just interested in what your behavior is. Jesus wants us to deal with the underlying issues, with the underlying fears, with the underlying things that are causing those behaviors. It's the why and the what. He deals with the cause and the effect and brings calm even in the midst of difficult circumstances. So what's the wind in your life? What's the fear? What's the worry? What's the thing that's causing the waves to swamp the boat of your life and perhaps leaking on to the boats of others as well? Because Jesus wants to deal with those, and Jesus wants us to deal with those. And maybe it will take Jesus and a licensed therapist to do that. Those things sometimes go well together. To really deal with the cause and the effects of the fears and the dread that we have in our lives. He woke up and rebuked the wind and the waves, and there was calm. And when there was calm, he said to them, "You big sissies." Right? That's what it says. "You scaredy cats. You nervous Nellies. This ship was never going down." No, he doesn't say that. In Luke's gospel, different from the others, he doesn't mention their fear at all. He invites them to see something different. Jesus says, "Where is your faith?" Jesus asked them a question. In the middle of all of this, where is your faith? Is your faith in yourself to deal with it all? Is your faith in the situation out there? Is your faith in someone else to try to make sense of all of this fear that we're dealing with? Where is your faith? And I think when we're dealing with fear, we all have to wrestle with this very question. Where is your faith in the middle of our fear? I don't think Jesus is chiding them for not having faith. They got in the boat with him in the first place. I think he's inviting them to reflect on where their faith is. More importantly, on who their faith is in. Not what their faith is in, not what their attention is drawn to, not what is going on in their life, but where is your faith? Because what fear tends to do is to empty our lives of faith. It tends to distract us from all the other things that are going on. And Jesus says when we focus on the who, it holds the weight of the what. And as our faith bucket fills, and as we trust Jesus more and more in the middle of all of our fears, we find our fears are a little lighter, and we're able to deal with them more. Where is your faith? Because I get so focused on what that I forget about who. Where is your faith in those fearful moments? And the disciples respond in this fascinating way. Jesus says, "Where's your faith?" And they were afraid and amazed and said to one another, "Who is this? That even the winds and the water obey him." And they learn what we all have to learn at some point, that the opposite of fear is not courage. The opposite of fear is trust. It's trusting who is on the boat with us. Who is in our lives. I can trust the one who is on the boat with me. I can have faith in the midst of my fear. Because what happens here is, as we have faith, it carries the weight of those fears. So even when we're in the middle of fear, it's our faith that's holding the water. So we're not sinking, not drowning, we're not perishing, we're not lost. Because no matter what I'm dealing with, I know who I can trust. If the simplest prayer that we can pray is just help, if the simplest definition of prayer is just acknowledging who is in the boat with us, then at its best, prayer is learning to trust in the midst of all of our fear and all of our worry and all of those things that we try to deal with on our own. So I'm going to ask you to do something a little different today. I'm going to ask you to trust a little bit. If you're struggling with fear today, if there's something in your life that's got you worried, upset, anxious, overwhelmed, if you're feeling a sense of worry, it could be a personal fear, it could be a provision fear, it could be a fear that's held you back from relationships or the job that you wish you had, whatever it is, I'm going to ask you to stand with me because I have all sorts of fears. And I just want you to open your hands like this and pray this prayer with me. I'm going to pray for us all. Just open your hands and agree with me in your spirit. Pray this. Master, we are lost. The wind and the waves are too much for us to handle. Lord, we need you to empty our fear and fill our faith. Jesus, we trust you. We know you are with us. But would you remind us today where our faith is? Would you remind us today that our faith is in you in the middle of all of our fear? That we know in the middle of all the what, we have a who. It's your Son, Jesus. Jesus, we trust you. Amen.